My name is Dennis Samut. I'm the director of Links Europe, a peace-building organization based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. For the last 30 years, I have traveled across the post-Soviet space and was close to many of the events and developments that impacted this vast region. In this series of video diaries, I will revisit some of the key issues that have dominated the region, and I will share some of my personal recollections and experiences. As recent developments in Ukraine have shown, much of what has happened in the past 30 years still has consequences in the present reality for people living in Europe and beyond. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the situation in the successor states was not very similar. In some of the republics that we have already looked at, for example, in the South Caucasus, there were political movements and political elites that had been aspiring for a considerable amount of time for greater autonomy and even independence. And so, in a sense, the collapse of the USSR resulted in these countries achieving what they had been aspiring for some time. But there were parts of the Soviet Union where this was not the case, and one of those areas is Central Asia. Central Asia is a huge region bordering Russia, which in the Soviet system was organized in 5 constituent republics of the USSR: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. And essentially, the elites in these countries were always paying lip service to the Communist Party, but they also had deep local roots. So essentially, Moscow tried to govern these republics with a light touch and to leave local elites as much as possible to run the show. This resulted in huge corruption in most of these republics and misgovernment, but it served the Soviet system because it meant that there was no big demands for change or big demands for reforms in the same way that there were in the Caucasus region. So when abruptly in 1991 the Soviet Union stopped existing, these 5 constituent republics, union republics of the USSR and Central Asia, were at first quite reluctant to take the natural step that had to result from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was to declare independence. Eventually it became clear that that was sort of the only option that they had in the present circumstances. And so they organized themselves as independent countries and were recognized by the world as independent countries together with the other former constituent republics. But there was hardly any change in the political leadership. The political leadership that existed before sort of continued over into the new system and the new situation, and very quickly adjusted to being not the leadership of the Soviet Republic, but to being the leadership of an independent republic. The 5 stans joined the OSCE, joined the United Nations, and became part of the community of nations. However, Moscow still controlled much of what was going on there in political, military, and economic terms. And what we saw in Central Asia in the 1990s was that, unlike what was happening in the Caucasus and in the European republics of the former USSR, in Central Asia there was hardly any external non-Russian impact or involvement. Turkey, because of historical, linguistic, and ethnic connections, tried very hard in the 1990s to build bridges with Central Asia and to try to extend influence, but it really was not very effective. In fact, the only effective external power that managed to engage with Central Asia and start gaining influence was China. China, because of its proximity, because of also some ethnic affinities, because of commercial and business interests, very quickly became an important player in the region. But for decades, the Chinese were extremely careful not to be seen in any way challenging the Russian hegemony. So China was there and was important, particularly economically, but in military, security, and political terms, the five Central Asian republics for a very long time remained very closely associated with Moscow. I went to Central Asia for the first time in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, and it was a very illuminating experience because, first of all, one could see that Soviet rule in Central Asia had a very different impact than it had in other parts of the USSR. There were very large Russian communities living particularly in Kazakhstan, who essentially were much more advanced intellectually and educationally than the local population, than the ethnic populations of the five republics. And so you had a situation where these Russian communities, very large, but still a minority, now had to somehow adjust to being in a country where they were a minority and where the titular nationality expected to have the political control. And there were clearly tensions there, but these tensions were quite carefully managed in places like Kazakhstan, for example, which, some people consider to be an artificial creation, but where the Kazakh population tried from early on to assert itself and try to take control of the political power. And under President Nazarbayev, it did achieve a certain amount of success in that regard. There were also some specific situations where there were similarities to what was going on in other parts of the Soviet Union. That is, that the collapse of the Union resulted in ethnic or other political tensions within the republics themselves. So there were problems in the Fergana Valley, and there were problems, of course, in Tajikistan. They were not really ethnic, they were more based on religious grounds, where a religious party essentially tried to seize control, and there was practically for a number of years a civil war. So when I went to Central Asia, one of our objectives was to try to understand, first of all, what was going on. Secondly, could it be that some of the things, some of the methodology that we were using in the Caucasus, could it be useful if adjusted to Central Asia? I can say that from the beginning we realized this was a completely different story, and that the space for work was quite limited. So in the end, our engagement with the five republics was rather more formal than practical. Of course, the situation in Central Asia has changed dramatically in recent years, and has changed dramatically particularly for two reasons. First, there was a generational transition 5 or 6 years ago. So some of the leaders that had been there for a very long time simply either died, or like Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan, or were too old to continue governing, like Nazarbayev. And a new generation of leaders took over. So this generation of leaders was from the elite. These were not leaders that were elected to a popular will. They were anointed leaders. But still, they came from a different generation. And still they recognized that to survive, they had to change. And so for the last 5 years, we have seen a process in most Central Asian republics of reform, very careful reform, and some would say artificial reform, but actually, given from where these countries started, these were quite significant steps. So I would say that this process started about 5 years ago is interesting, is genuine, and can actually bring about some changes that we had not seen in this part of the world since these countries achieved independence. But of course, the second factor that then accelerated this was the war in Ukraine. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine essentially rang alarm bells right across the former Soviet space. First of all, here was Russia trying to reassert its imperial domination by force, And this created quite a lot of unease right across the post-Soviet space. But also here was Russia that now was engaged in a very messy war that these countries did not want to get involved in. And here was Russia that was under sanctions from the West, so doing business with Russia became a complicated process and not a very pleasant one. So this meant that the reform processes started, particularly in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, in 2017 and 2018, basically accelerated once the war in Ukraine started. Where will it go and how far will it go is still open to question. Some people say that what is happening in Central Asia is superficial, that there is no real process of reform, that these are simply the elites trying to consolidate their positions. But I think there's a bit more going on than that, and this is partly because the younger generation in Central Asia has different demands than the older generation, bigger expectations, and also, in a sense, is ready to challenge more the leadership than its previous generations. Three countries that we have not discussed in this series, but which are of course very central to the story of the post-Soviet space, are Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. I will leave Ukraine to the last because it is both the beginning and the end, and the beginning again of the story that we are telling. Belarus, from the very beginning, first of all, it was the Belarusian political leadership in 1991 was instrumental in forcing for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But this was a nationalist leadership that very quickly lost power once Belarus became an independent country. And very quickly the leadership of Lukashenko emerged, and it became very obvious that this was not a leadership that was interested in reform. On the other hand, it was interested in consolidating power and in making sure that it had complete control over power. So what we have seen happening in Belarus for nearly 30 years now is a process of essentially a dictatorship of one person that has really exhausted the country and exhausted its political strength and its political aspirations. Lukashenko played a very interesting game. On the one hand, he advocated the closest of possible relations with Russia, even to the point of agreeing to establish with Russia a union state. So for people in the former Soviet Union, the word union state has, connotations that are clear in terms of what it means. But Lukashenko was ready to do that because he wanted full Russian support as he faced pressure from the West on democracy, human rights, and election fraud, and so on and so on. On the other hand, Lukashenko has not been an easy client for Moscow. In fact, he has been a very demanding client, always wanting something else, always wanting something more, always criticizing Moscow for not delivering on this or on that. So Lukashenko is not someone that is warmly loved in the Kremlin, but someone that the Kremlin became more and more dependent on, and particularly this has been the case after the invasion of Ukraine, because Belarus was one of the very few countries that supported Russia. It was a country that also offered some kind of military assistance. Although Lukashenko has also played this very delicately, he has tried to distance himself from some of the Russian decisions, and he has distanced himself from the issue of the territorial disintegration of Ukraine. This is something that Belarus has been consistent on for a long time. For example, when Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states, everybody thought that Belarus would follow suit very soon, but it has never done so. So that is another example of how Lukashenko plays his cards. Today, it's a different kind of situation because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, which means that essentially the options for both for Lukashenko and for the West are more limited. So whilst the Belarusian leadership continues to try to send signals sometimes that it wants relations with the European Union, it wants relations with the United States, on the other hand, its room for maneuver is even less today than it was before. There is a very strong opposition movement within Belarus, particularly in parts of Belarus, which have a very strong sort of European identity. And this movement challenged the elections that were held a couple of years back. But of course, Lukashenko has very tight control over the security apparatus in the country and was able to resist popular pressure to move aside. What will happen when Lukashenko dies is perhaps a more interesting question, because this is very much a personalized regime. And so once he's gone, it's difficult to see where exactly Belarus will go. The Russians hope that they have invested enough in the current Belarusian elite to ensure that Belarus will remain very strongly a Russian ally. But there are many forces in Belarus that are very disenchanted with the present situation. Moldova, like the countries in the South Caucasus, Moldova, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was faced with the prospect of secession for very similar reasons. There was a Russian base in Moldova, and the Russians were not keen to leave. So they encouraged the people in Tiraspol to somehow secede and create an independent republic within Moldova. The situation was not as dramatic as in the Caucasus. There was some fighting and there were some victims, but the number of people who died, the number of consequences in terms of refugees were on a much smaller scale. And even today, although the situation remains quite tense and Moldova is still not able to assert its territorial integrity, yet the situation is somehow more relaxed in Moldova than it is, say, with Georgia and Georgian Abkhazia and Georgia and South Ossetia. There is in Moldova a very strong party that essentially is the leftover of the Communist Party. And at some point this party even was in the government for a number of years. It had the presidency. It seems that power has now shifted back to pro-Western parties, and Moldova is now, together with Ukraine, a country that has a European Union membership perspective, even candidate status. And of course this puts Moldova in a completely different position than it was, say, 5 or even more, 10 years ago. And so we come to Ukraine. For Russia, the importance of Ukraine cannot be overestimated. And whilst one does not have any sympathy with President Putin's adventurism, one does understand the logic from where he comes from, and from where many in the Russian establishment and Russian elite come from, in that from the Russian perspective, for Russia to be a great country, it must have Ukraine as part of its strategic depth. This has been for many centuries a Russian perspective, and this perspective still remains today. So this Russian obsession with Ukraine, is something that has not started yesterday and is not going to end tomorrow. This is a reality that is going to be part of the European geopolitical situation for a long time to come. But up to 2022, it was understood that Russia would try to achieve its objectives in Ukraine through hybrid tactics of political pressure, economic pressure, some cajoling, some carrots and some sticks. Although, of course, when it essentially annexed Crimea, it had already taken a very major step in the direction of trying to assert its claims by military force. Many argue, and I would agree, that where we are today because the West was not strong enough in reacting in 2014 to the annexation of Crimea, to the Russian annexation of Crimea, and then to the adventurism in the Donbass, which saw a sort of a cordon sanitaire that the Russians created around Crimea. based essentially on areas that were mainly Russian-speaking. So this failure of the West inevitably, in my view, resulted in what happened then in 2022, when Putin felt confident enough to be able to say, well, actually this Ukraine never really existed, this was all a fiction created by Lenin, and we're going in to correct this historical mistake, which is essentially what Putin said one day before the invasion of Ukraine. But it misfired. And this is one of the more interesting episodes in what has happened in the post-Soviet space in the last 30 years. Why it misfired? What happened in Ukraine that all of a sudden made Ukraine, instead of just simply a place ready, in a sense, to be taken over by an assertive Russian leadership, into a very determined country that was willing to resist Russian aggression? So one needs to understand, of course, that in Ukraine there are areas that historically have been anti-Russian. After the Second World War, there were still pockets of Ukrainian resistance against Soviet rule. 10 years after World War II ended in the forests. So there has been a resistance to Russian domination. But that is essentially a situation in Western Ukraine. But the emergence of a strong Ukrainian identity and a strong enough government to be able to resist in the way that Zelensky has been able to resist for the last year and a half. This is something that is reasonably new and is worth assessing and addressing. A few months before the Russian invasion, I hosted in The Hague a group of Ukrainian lawyers, and we had a very frank, open discussion about the situation, and I basing myself on what I knew about Ukraine, which was a little bit out of date, not very much, but out of date by, say, 5 or 6 years, because I had not been following very closely, because I was focused more on other issues. I had this understanding that Ukraine was a very fractured country, that it really did not have a very strong central leadership, that it was rotten from the inside because of corruption. And these guys were trying very seriously to convince me that, look, the situation has changed. The situation is dramatically different. And I listened carefully, and of course I had no reason to question what they were telling me, but I had my doubts. And it was only after the Russian invasion, and after what we saw emerging as a much more effective Ukrainian army, a much more cohesive Ukrainian government, and a much more, in a sense, resolute Ukrainian people, that one understood how the processes that had been started 15, 20 years ago, but that accelerated enormously after the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, that somehow was a wake-up call for Ukraine and Ukrainians about what was about to happen. And I think we in the West, we all underestimated this, which is why everyone, or nearly everyone, in February 2022 thought that Ukraine was not able to resist, will not be able to resist. There's the famous quote by a German minister who said, well, it will all be over in a week. Well, it wasn't. And it wasn't for two reasons. One, because of Russian inefficiency and incompetence, but also, one has to say, it was because the Ukrainian government and leadership actually showed that it was ready to stand and fight. So this is important for the usual reasons that are mentioned when one is talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's important because of the rules-based international system. It's important that in Europe of the 2022, one country does not invade another country and takes all of it or some of it. It's important because it is not possible to think that Russia can create this hegemonic area around itself in the way that it visualizes. So those arguments are always put forward, but I want to put forward another argument, which is why it is important. It is important because without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. So if Russia is ever to come out from its approach that it is an empire, and with all the connotations that has, that will require an acceptance of the fact that Ukraine is not Russia. And Ukraine is not simply a Russian protectorate. Ukraine is an independent country, a neighbor, rather than a vassal state. So what is happening in Ukraine has huge importance for both the security of Europe, for the future of peace in Europe, but of course it is important because it's not only defining Ukraine, but what is happening in Ukraine is also defining Russia. And this, I think, is something that we will be looking at more carefully in the future. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many in Moscow and other parts of Russia did not really accept the fact that all the countries, all the republics that had been part of the Soviet Union were now independent states. And the process to try to somehow maintain influence, one can say hegemony, over these countries started, one can say, from the very beginning. So first there was an attempt to keep everything together through the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. But as one very clever Russian politician, Primakov, once said, once the knife of disintegration has started cutting, it cuts all the arteries, and that means that it is very difficult to keep something together that has been cut off already. So the process has not been easy and has not been painless. Under Yeltsin, the attempts to try to keep post-Soviet space together in some kind of union or in some kind of form where Russia could continue to exert its influence on the countries on its periphery were half-hearted. There were people in the system that wanted to do this. Yeltsin himself was not quite sure whether he wanted to do this. And within the Russian establishment, particularly the emerging Russian economic establishment, there was the idea that we need to consolidate what we have. We need to develop economically. That should be our priority, not adventures in the so-called near abroad. And so under Yeltsin there was this tension between these different ideas. But when Putin took over, it was very clear that Putin came from a different perspective. He came from a security background. He clearly said once that the solution of the Soviet Union was one of the most terrible things that could ever have happened. And so we can see that there has been a pattern during the rule of Vladimir Putin to try to accelerate the process of somehow reintegration, of somehow bringing back these peripheral countries within Moscow's orbit. Up to 2022, the process had been opportunistic. So it meant that some situation arose, the Kremlin used it as an opportunity to strengthen its position. Sometimes it created its own dynamic that would result in the situation changing, but sometimes things just happened and then they took an opportunistic approach to try to nibble back what had been lost. But 2022 marked a very different phase. Now the Kremlin was not being opportunistic, it was being proactive, and it was going out all the way. So what we saw in Ukraine was really a break with the past tactics and a new tactic emerging, which is why throughout the post-Soviet space, the invasion of Ukraine was met with shock, and Russia found very few friends, even as I mentioned earlier, in Belarus, although the government supported Putin, it had no other choice, but on the other hand, it also in different ways showed that it was concerned. Russia, apart from its military strength, has also a lot of other tools and assets in the post-Soviet space. First of all, networks that come from the time of the Soviet Union that for a long time remained very strong even though the Soviet Union had collapsed. people who had been to universities in Russia, they may keep an affinity with these institutions, people that had been part of cultural business groups or whatever else kept the Union moving in the Soviet system. These networks weakened, but they still remained valid. But of course, as time passes, their influence becomes less and less. And what has become also less and less is the influence of the Russian language. So Russia was essentially the lingua franca in the whole of the post-Soviet space. It was in many places the first language, but at least in everywhere it was the second language. So everywhere outside of Russia there may have been titular languages, but Russian was very much a second language. Sometimes it was the other way around. Russian was the first language in terms of government, education and science and culture, whereas the local languages were simply for more day-to-day popular use. But this is changing. So if you want to see one measurement of Russian influence, you can look at the way that English has replaced Russian as the second language for many, if not most, of the people in the former Soviet republics, particularly in places like the South Caucasus, in Georgia, in Armenia even, and even in Azerbaijan. English very quickly started replacing Russian. And this is for Russian influence, this is quite an important shift, which frankly, I don't think that the Russian government acted either strongly enough or swiftly enough to try to reverse. It was one area which was not really given too much importance. There were some measures, but in my view, they were not so assertive as we have seen in other ways. So here there was something that was lost. But if you want to understand where the future is, the key is to try to understand young people. So this is really where change has been happening and is happening, and where a new mentality is emerging that very, very strongly challenges the past and offers some vision of the future. I'm not saying that the situation is going to change abruptly tomorrow, but I'm saying that all the indicators are that right across the post-Soviet space, and I will come to Russia itself in a moment, but right across the post-Soviet space, we are seeing a young generation that is much more globalized, is much more ready to look at all other alternatives. In the beginning, maybe they were over-influenced by American culture or whatever, but I think these days they are much more discerning. So I think this is not a question of just simply adopting American culture because you like cowboy movies and chewing gum. You know, this is about something much deeper and a desire to be much more selective in the way one thinks and one acts. I can say that I see this trend right across the post-Soviet space. In some places, like in Georgia, you see it much more acutely because there's a young generation here that really thinks in a very sort of different way than its predecessors. On the other hand, this is not simply a Georgian issue. It is a feature that one can identify in a number of countries. Some time ago, I was in Turkmenistan. Well, perhaps one of the most closed of the post-Soviet republics. And I was talking to a young Turkmen. I was trying to understand, how young Turkmens spend their evenings, how do they spend their weekends, and so he was trying to explain to me, and then he sort of said, look, we young Turkmen are very cool. The problem is we don't know how to be cool together. And I think that sort of captured in a sense, part of the process that is going on. There are a lot of changes in the young generation in the post-Soviet space that are taking place within individuals. In some countries, like in Georgia, these processes are now galvanizing together. So you have not only individuals going through this process of change in their attitude and their mentality, but the whole community now is able to act in this way. But in many countries, and particularly I would say even in Russia itself, the process is still quite personal. The problem is the process is within individuals. Individuals are in their own home, in their own world, thinking through some of the issues and adjusting their mentality. But this process has not yet galvanized into a national movement or a national process. And I'm not talking about revolutions, this is much deeper. It's not about the political issues, it's about social issues, it's about how you approach the world, it's about how you deal with day-to-day life issues. It's much more basic than political expression. Political expression is just a small part of this process. I feel that it is these processes within the young generation in the post-Soviet space that are going to mark the future. Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, was the end of an episode. Clearly, the region will not be the same again. So something has happened and something of the past has snapped and something of the dynamic of relations between the different countries and Russia has changed. What will replace it is not clear. The only way we can try to visualize what will happen is if we try to understand where these young generations are going. What is it they are aspiring for? Where will they want to take their countries? And I think right across the post-Soviet space, including in Russia, there is a generational problem that some leaders have been there for a very long time. There has not been a sort of an opportunity for renewal, even generational renewal, let alone political renewal. So these processes will soon, in some form or other, come to a point where some conclusions will have to be drawn. I come to the end of this series of 6 video diaries in which I reflected on my experience of work, travel in the post-Soviet space since 1991. Whilst telling my story, I have very much been interested and tried to tell the story of the region itself, because in many ways there were many overlaps. I feel privileged in having had the chance to travel in these countries, to meet people, to experience their pains and their joys, at times of war, at times of national jubilation, at times of economic difficulties, at times of economic boom. Frankly speaking, it's been from one extreme to the other in many situations, and this leaves you, to a certain extent, a little bit unbalanced, but on the other hand, it exposes you to experiences that are very difficult otherwise to experience in simply one lifetime. And so I feel privileged that I've had the opportunity to go through these experiences. And I am hugely thankful to the dozens, hundreds, thousands maybe, of people who have helped me on the way. There have been so many instances of small kindnesses that people show when they don't necessarily need to, particularly in difficult circumstances. And in the 1990s, the economic situation, even in places like Georgia, was not so good. People did not really have a lot of money or resources, but wherever you went, somebody would give you a cup of coffee, at least. Usually they would try to make you eat. They would offer you a bed if you needed it. And this was not just in the cities, it was especially if you went out in the countryside. You sometimes went into a village that had maybe even been traumatized by some recent conflict, and you would still find people there ready to engage, ready to talk to you. A little bit cautiously at first. You needed to get their trust. But once you got that trust, then they opened up. They told you the story of their lives. I learned so much from things that I was told in these meetings, not with leaders. These were interesting enough, but meetings with normal people right across the Soviet Union. Young people especially sometimes are more willing to sort of be open and honest. There were moments when I was traveling in some of the Russian regions like Vladimir and Ivanovo, close to Moscow, regions that had experienced serious economic difficulties, but where people were still trying to see what their future is, where it is that they were going. Many people still trusted their leaders, even though they could recognize that there were many mistakes. And unfortunately, on many occasions, people were disappointed and let down. And there is, I think, one overarching feeling that one senses from many of these conversations, which is a sense of cynicism. People are not really ready to trust leaders and politicians very much anymore. And this has some consequences that I think will also have some impact on the future. But for the moment, my word of advice to anyone who is thinking about working more on this part of the world, about learning more, do it. This is a hugely interesting part of the world. It is a dynamic region of the world. It is a place where things are going to be happening more and more in the coming years. And I hope that you will have the same satisfying experience that I have had of engaging with this huge region that stretches from the center of Europe to the Pacific Ocean.